green fingers coming in. So we get the lungs, we get to keep our park space, and have those finger and point right into the heart of the cove, which again is very uniquely Bowen and a great opportunity afforded by this concept.
I want to emphasize that I'm not sure how many of you have had the chance to work with some of the sort of frontline town planners in North America right now, but most of them have a model in their mind about how a town should work, and we're watching and we're getting involved in a number of them, and they come and they literally take that plan and they just squish it onto the site, and they push the site basically out of the way. What was interesting here, it sounds kind of logical, it sounds common sense to not do that here, but it would have been very easy to have done that. And I think something that you have brought forward, that came forward in the design, not just the interstitial spaces between buildings, but actually the way that a development can fit itself into an island, to a place. It's one of the intriguing things that happens. Snug Cove is interesting right now because initially it had the steamship company that came in kind of laid a certain plan in a very small area, and then it's kind of fit itself in as it's grown. And when you add a lot more density to it, the question is, how do you do it? Because the bulldozers arrive and you can push everything out. And part of the driving ethos behind this was to make it feel like this was part of that evolution. So what you see is that the fingers. The second thing is that if you want to go somewhere on the island and walk there, part of the charm of the island and why you live here is you don't want to be walking down an urban street all the time. Otherwise you'd go live somewhere else. So this allows you actually to move from just about anywhere in the village to just about anywhere else, and probably spend at least 50% of that time in a non-urban experience, which is kind of part of the experience of the island.
So again, transportation, as I've mentioned already, is a critical element, and densification and making a compact community reduces the need for transportation. Is a fairly obvious thing. And maybe Mark, you want to expand on the bigger issue of that?
Yeah, the question of transportation on the island, we've all been talking about it. It's a big issue because you've set yourself a very kind of high moral goal of climate change emission reductions. A lot of people are talking about it. You're taking it far more seriously than most, from what I can tell. You're going to continue, unless you want to bring an enormous amount of economic commercial space onto the island to provide you all with jobs, and provide the people who provide services for you all with sufficient scope of customers that they can locate their businesses here. You're going to be having a very permanent and serious relationship with off-island environments. However, to the extent that you can begin to have that relationship with enough demand here to begin to put pressure on alternative systems for you to move around that are convenient and comfortable and viable, frankly, the kind of densities here are going to be key. That will help you. The second thing is that with respect to Esteban's circles of all the different kind of uses, if you can get every extra bit of density here that's well managed, gives you that many more services in there. Of course, we've had this conversation together before, and it means that for folks who don't live in the village, who live the rest of the island, there's that many more trips. You will not actually have to leave the island. You'll be able to start cutting that down. And the interesting thing is, you don't have to get all that many more services before you'll start seeing measurable drops in your need to leave the island for some basic things, particularly for whole classes of your whole groups of people who live here, semi-retired, and others that don't have to commute for jobs.
So from that, this will make more sense as we go through the plan, but we started with the concept of saying, okay, if we can make the core of the cove, the lower cove, a tight area that's much more pedestrian focused, then how do we get people to transition out of that? So we're proposing a number of parking situations and modal shifts in the outer ring of the cove, and I'll get into more detail about that later, but this is the concept for that. In addition to that, this is probably the most important slide of this early part. How do we make the pedestrian first? How do we make the systems that Mark just mentioned about wanting to get from A to B, and there are a lot of A to Bs that we're thinking of and they already exist in the cove. How do we make that easy, enjoyable, and something you choose to do instead of getting in your car to go and do any of the services that we need to do? And again, we have this great opportunity where we have these green spaces that interject into the cove. But what we've done as well is introduce a number of crossings across Grafton and Government Road. And the intention here, and these would be raised crossings that are designed in such a way that they say the pedestrian is first and the car is not. And I can get into the road systems that we've planned as well that try to help that concept as well. This allows, you know, I'm not going to get into detail, but it does allow you to get from places like Artisan Square, and I know there's some topography involved in that, but it allows those kind of cross movements through the cove. In addition to that, if you're coming from other parts of the island by bike or as a pedestrian, we need to integrate that into this system so that where I live, for instance, I have a 15-minute walk and I shouldn't be driving down here, you know, and a lot of us are in that situation.
I can just say a couple things with this one. It's interesting when what studies that have been done on people moving around on foot, the experience of that public realm, and again, it sounds like common sense to say this, but actually you have to do a study to prove it. The experience of the spaces you're in and how comfortable that is has a huge influence, almost as much as distance, for whether or not you're going to walk there. So you know what it's like to walk on a really inhospitable place. You think about it, you go, I just don't want to do it. It may only be a block or two away, but I just don't want to do it. What this plan did is an attempt to create the experience of going from anywhere. Those sort of interstitial corridors between buildings aren't just a aesthetic device to make it feel like Bowen Island. They're actually part of a strategic experience of moving around that will be far more interesting than simply trucking down a typical sidewalk. So you're actually going to have a far superior experience of being a pedestrian. Even though you have some very intense topography to grapple with, the experience of walking around here is going to be far superior than probably most any development blowing in mind, if not to see.
So the next goal was based, Esteban just told you that 70% of our greenhouse gas issues on Bowen are transportation. This still leaves 30%, which is not. And the Cove needs to be self-sustaining in energy over time, and we're going to show you some of the ways that we propose to do that over the long term. It's a big issue. But clearly the infrastructure that's needed in the Cove is something that has to be undertaken early on in order for that to work. So I don't know, Esteban, if you wanted to talk about this slide at all, or should I?
Well, I guess the only, the main thing here is to understand that you have two main dependencies as an island. And one is your heating loads and your electricity loads. And heating-wise, you have great opportunities on the island. You have the ocean surrounding the island. There are technologies available, and BC it has proven to be a great place to store thermal load. So there's a number of technologies available for you to address your heating loads, and therefore your main and more complicated target is electricity. But electricity is another ballgame as well. It's, you know, BC Hydro is claiming to be carbon neutral by 2016, so it seems to be an easier target as we go, as we move forward. But basically what we're saying is that the most cost-effective and sustainable way of making a community energy efficient is by diversifying your energy portfolio and creating the proper partnerships between buildings and district energy systems. So energy generated at the community level. When both components start working together, the synergy provides much better and long-lasting benefits than just addressing either buildings or infrastructure.
Part of the other aspect of this was in your sustainability strategy, you talked about energy systems and doing strategies for the whole system, and that's what was attempted here, was to look at all of the sources, all of the sinks for multiple sides of energy, and you start getting those kinds of diagrams that start connecting the whole code.
So, ironically, all of these technologies are already used on the island, including the ocean loop. So it's not a big leap, it's just that we want to apply them in a district-wide way. And we've identified areas where this would make the most sense. Geothermal and solar is going to be very site-specific to buildings, but the ocean loop could serve the lower cove from the cove itself. And wind power, which Esteban is even giving me more update tonight, talking to a consultant, that this is actually an ideal place to power up to half of the cove from one turbine. Buildings. We have a lot of expertise on our team that dealt with that. Andy and Esteban have created a report for the island, which I encourage you to read through. It's almost as thick as ours, which goes into great detail of how to apply that, but it's obviously a key ingredient in Cove. And again, it's based on Esteban's idea that he just mentioned of mixing your portfolio of green technologies, not committing to one. And believe it or not, solar is actually a very applicable technology on Bowen. The latest technology works in cloudy conditions quite well. and rainwater collection. These slides are in particular